Started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Courtney Dogger, and I'm the president of Network 2020. And we are very lucky today to have Helen Lackner join us for Network 2020's virtual briefing series. So for those of you who don't know, Network 2020 is a nonprofit organization that works to create more informed conversations around foreign affairs, and are doing that during the time of coronavirus online through our virtual briefing series, which are right now free and open to all. So today, we are quite lucky to have Helen Lackner joining us to talk about Yemen. She is a visiting fellow at the European Council for Foreign Relations and a research associate at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. She was the 2016, I believe, Sir William Luce Fellow at Durham University. Her latest book is Yemen in Crisis, The Road to War, which was published in the US by Verso in 2019. And Brian will send a link around to that for those of you who are interested. She has contributed chapters to a number of recent and forthcoming books on the UN role in Yemen, water issues, Yemeni social structure. Self-standing papers include War and Pieces, Political Divides in Southern Yemen, and Yemen's peaceful transition from autocracy, Could It Have Succeeded?, as well as Understanding the Yemeni Crisis, the Transformation of Tribal Roles in Recent Decades. She edited Why Yemen Matters, A Society in Transition, and other books. She is a regular contributor to Open Democracy, Arab Digest, and Oxford Analytica. She also speaks on the Yemen crisis and many public events in Europe and the Middle East. Her earlier career as a rural development consultant took her to more than 30 countries in the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and Europe, where she worked on a wide range of agricultural, community development, and fisheries projects. In recent years, she has recycled to focus on in-depth analytic work and writing. She now mainly writes about the crisis in Yemen, a country with which she has been involved since the early 1970s and where she lived for more than 15 years between the 1970s and 2010. So she is really quite an expert, very in-depth on Yemen, and we're lucky to have her here today. So just, really briefly to back up for everyone who's joining us, why are we talking about Yemen? As many of you know, since 2015, they've been mired in a civil war between the Houthis, backed by Iran, and the Yemeni government, backed by a coalition led by Saudi Arabia. The estimated number of deaths are over 100,000, and that includes 12,000 civilians. And those numbers are only those that are directly related to war and do not include those affected by disease, famine, and other causes. In 2019, the United Nations warned that 16 million Yemeni civilians face starvation and what could become the worst famine in the world in 100 years. The US is actually one of the largest donors to Yemen, giving over 700 million last year in aid. And as we are all aware, in these interconnected yet isolated times, the world won't be safe from COVID-19 until we can prevent future outbreaks in vulnerable places like Yemen. With that, I want to just remind everyone that you can ask questions throughout this talk by putting a question into the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand to be unmuted, or you can email Brian at bthang@network2020.org. I'm going to have a conversation with Helen for probably about 20 minutes or half an hour, and then we will open it up for the general Q&A. So with that, Helen, I realize that this is a very difficult task, but could you kindly bring us up to speed, because most of us are not experts in Yemen, on how the situation in Yemen got to where it is today? And for those of you on the call or listening after, I just ask you to bear in mind that we're doing this in a very quick fashion, that the situation is very complex, and it's hard to do it justice in a short answer, but we just want to lay a little bit of groundwork.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me first, and also mainly for having people who are interested in Yemen, which is not a very general phenomenon. The reason Yemen has reached its current state of extreme disaster, I think, is there's a whole series of reasons behind this. And the war started in 2015 after basically 33 years of rule by Ali Abdallah Saleh, who ran a very autocratic system and who also ran a system that did not help the population survive. The population continued to increase at about 3% per annum, which means that the population of Yemen doubles every 20 years in a situation where the natural resources to support this are very, very weak. And this is something that hopefully will come up again in the questions. So what we had is by the beginning of the century, you had a series of wars going on between the Houthi movement and the Saleh regime. And the Houthi movement initially were a small group of Zaydi revivalists. Now, not that many people know about Zaydism. Zaydism is a form of Shiism. It is not the same thing as the Twelver Shiism that you find in Iran and in most other countries. And theologically, it has very few differences with the kind of Sunni movement, Sunni religion that exists in the rest of Yemen, or the Sunni form of Islam. But you had this movement that rose in the far north of the country, and I think if we look at the map, basically we're talking about that area around Saada. And there was a series of wars between the government, then run by Saleh, and the Houthi movement. By the time they ended in 2010, it was just around the time the Arab Spring started. And the Arab Spring in Yemen was very strong and very significant, and was something that took place throughout the whole country. But it also was limited in the sense that it ended up being much more of a struggle between different elite groups that were connected with Saleh or against Saleh. And because of an international intervention from the Gulf Cooperation Council states and other states, including the US, Britain, and other EU states, there was an agreement made at the end of 2011, which led to a transition. And the transition was due to last for 2 years and was supposed to help turn the country into a regime that would respond a bit better to the needs of the population, which had been throughout this period increasingly impoverished, and whereas living conditions were getting much worse, in addition to also the political system reaching a level of paralysis. Now, that 2-year transition effectively failed for a number of reasons, which I think we probably don't have time to go into unless somebody asks later, and led to the collapse of the transition by late 14, early 15, and the internationalization of the war, which meant at that point that we had, on the one side, you had the Houthis, who by that time had allied with their former enemy, Saleh. You have to always remember in Yemen that alliances are very temporary and they can turn around very, very quickly. And they were fighting the internationally recognized government, i.e. the government that came in through the transition and which was expelled from Sana'a, at which point it asked for assistance from what became the Saudi-led coalition. And the Saudi-led coalition is basically a military coalition which is led by the Saudis, as its name implies, and which is very active and has one other important member, which is the United Arab Emirates. Other members of the coalition are basically troops on the ground or providing moral support, and I think we probably don't need to go into that. So basically, by now, the main elements or the main players you have are the Houthis, you have the Saudis, you have the internationally recognized government, which is mostly in exile, but theoretically it's based in Aden, the capital Aden, which was on the southern coast, and which was the capital of one of the 2 earlier states prior to the formation of the Republic of Yemen. And in a fourth element you have, which comes up now, because in Aden you have a new conflict which is within the coalition movement between the southern separatists and the rest of the government, which is another complicated question which we may or may not go into at this point. Do you want to move on, or have I confused everybody totally by now?
So I think we're all getting a sense of how complex this is. So in short, we have for different players, we have the Saudi-led coalition, which apparently has a rift within it that's developing among the Saudis and the Emiratis. We have the Iranian-backed Houthis, and then we have the international community.
And you have the official, legitimate, internationally recognized government.
Right. Exactly.
Which is theoretically based in Aden, but in practice based in Riyadh, which is the capital of Saudi Arabia.
Okay, all right. So complex indeed, which leads to my next question, which is about Saudi Arabia and its coalition announcing in early April a unilateral 2-week ceasefire. And could you speak a little bit about the reasoning behind this move and its implications for the future?
Yeah, I think the important thing to remember is that Saudi Arabia has been involved in Yemen for almost 100 years now, and the Saudi state has only existed since 1932. So it's been involved in Yemen since 1934. So there's nothing new about the Saudis being involved in Yemen. What was new and surprising in 2015 is that the war and all these things started immediately after Salman had become king and was beginning to promote Mohammed bin Salman at that time as Minister of Defense, and as most people know by now, as Crown Prince. Now, Mohammed bin Salman, as probably most of you know, is somebody who's been up to some pretty erratic and unpredictable acts. And the war in Yemen was really his first operation, which was basically 2 months after he became he became Minister of Defense. Now, it's very clear to me that what he thought at the time, and I think it's widely accepted, that what he thought at the time is that, here we are with our millions or billions of dollars of Western, US, French, German, UK weapons, etc., etc. We've been trained by all these experts. We must have the best army in the world, or at least in the Middle East. And here are this bunch of Houthis up in the hills with their AK-47s and not much else. And they will obviously be surrendering within a matter of weeks. I think that was the original plan. Very obviously, 5 years later, this plan has not actually worked. Not only have they not been defeated, but the Houthis have been actually crossing the border into Saudi Arabia. There have been missile attacks on Saudi cities, and they're basically nowhere near being defeated, on the contrary. So I think eventually the Saudis have come to the conclusion that they really want to get out. I believe that they've wanted to do that for at least 2 years now. There's been two problems that have prevented them from getting out. The first is that they want to get out without losing face. So they want to get out in a way that makes it look as if they are, if not winning, at least not losing. And the second one is the Houthi element. The Houthis, in a way, the Houthis need the Saudi war far more than the Saudis need the Houthis, because it gives them many things that they need. Particularly, it helps them control their population and retain much more support. They have very limited support, but at least it gives them some of support as long as there is a foreign enemy. So I think what happened for this ceasefire is that it was fantastically well timed. It was timed in such a way that it looked like a response to the request by the UN Secretary General for ceasefires on all fronts around the world. And it looked like they were doing, taking a very humanitarian and positive action. And they timed it so that it would expire just before Ramadan started. So that meant that you could then extend it easily for the whole month of Ramadan. And it's also worth remembering that the Saudis and the Houthis have actually been involved in very quiet talks since last September. And so I am assuming, because I have absolutely no knowledge I'm assuming that, the idea was that this would give them the time to find make some kind of deal, at least gives them 6 weeks. I think, they were trying to do that, and I think they're still trying to do that, because if you look at the situation in late 2019, the number of, for example, Saudi airstrikes was dropping dramatically to a very, very low number. And the impression was that they would basically fizzle out, and there would or wouldn't be a deal, but the war would kind of basically wind down, at least the Saudi element of the war. And what happened in the beginning of this year, particularly in January, February, is that the Houthis started a major offensive in the north. And, in this particular, basically in the area that I'm pointing now on the map, and basically attacked, the internationally recognized government forces. And so the Saudis were forced, or felt they had to come in and restore and start again the airstrikes so that they would be able to support the government and not let the Houthis basically win. So I think that was the main plan, I think, at this point for the Saudi withdrawal. And I think they're still very much hoping that they will be able to find some solution so that they can really exit. I mean, as we know, the Saudis have many other problems at the moment. I mean, the collapse in the oil prices, the COVID-19, that's a problem shared by plenty around the world, and other issues that they really don't need the war, which is also costing them a lot of money at a time when their cash situation is not quite what it used to be.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. So it sounds, if I hear you correctly, it sounds as though the Saudis are eager to find a good way to exit, but it's the Houthis that feel as though they need this war for generally their own political purposes. So
I think most people don't emphasize the Houthi element, but I think it is something. And if you look at what happened as a response to the proposal for the ceasefire, I think that also suggests that the Houthis have the upper hand at the moment, and so they really feel they can dictate terms. I think one of the problems is that most of us aren't quite sure what exactly the terms are that they want to dictate.
And of course, as we touched on a little bit earlier, there's a whole humanitarian element to this, the humanitarian implications of the war. And I'd like to return to that just for a few minutes, especially in light of the coronavirus pandemic. Could you just expand a little bit on the humanitarian situation? What is healthcare like in general, and how is COVID-19 impacting that system and the population?
Yeah, I mean, the humanitarian situation is extremely grave. I mean, it's very difficult to find adequate words to deal with this. The UN claims that 24 million out of 30 million of the population are in need of something, some humanitarian or aid or other. The figures are estimates. They may not be accurate, but the basic situation is that the need is enormous. The situation is extremely serious. It's important to remember that, before this started, I mean, even in, say, 2012, the level of poverty in Yemen was already over 55%. So Yemen has been the poorest country in the region for many decades. So it started from a very low base. It also, although it's still very largely a rural country with more than 70% living in rural areas, it is also a country that has been primarily dependent on food imports for its basic needs. So 90% of its wheat, which is the main staple of the highlands, 100% of the rice, which is a main staple on the coast, 100% of tea, sugar, and other, and which are really basic elements of survival, have been imported for decades. So the fact that there is a blockade and that people have no money because most people haven't been paid as a result of another complex situation of a transfer of the central bank, which I won't go into, but the result of that has been that, well over 1 million people, which means about 7 million if you include their dependents, have been paid approximately for 1 month every 5 months from salaries, which were already very low at the best of times, at a time when, of course, the food costs and everything else has increased dramatically. So you have a situation, you know, where you have a massive level of malnutrition in the population in general. The places, the most remote places, are the ones that are most in need. And so you have basically a weakened population. You have a health system or a medical system which was fairly weak to start with, and also fairly dependent on external aid, which has basically been, people use the word decimated, but literally decimate means cut down by 10%, and this one's been cut down by 50%. So I'm trying to think what the alternative word would be. So you basically have approximately half the medical facilities functioning, and they were already inadequate. You've had a massive rise, a major cholera epidemic, which started 3 years ago, and which was then the worst epidemic in the world. In 2018, the cholera cases dropped down to about, I think, 300,000, but check it, don't quote me on that. And last year they rose up to 1 million again. This year, up to now, they're only up to about 100,000. So we're talking about, you know, that is one major issue. And one of the responses that has taken place through the, you know, the various aid agencies has been to transfer centers that had been prepared for cholera, to transfer them to COVID. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the cholera situation has gone. So it just means that, you know, inadequate facilities for one disease have now been transferred to another disease. You also have a very serious dengue fever, you have malaria, and you have all the, you know, normal diseases that people suffer from. So you have a very, very weakened situation, you know, from the point of view of the medical system. You have, I think another element which I like to talk about, because it's so important, is the issue of water. I mean, water, the absence of clean water and a clean drainage is one of the major causes for cholera. It's also one of the major causes of, you know, worsening and making living conditions difficult for people throughout the country. So I think it's really important, you know, to remember that. It's also important to notice that the medical staff, a lot of them have been dependent for the last 2 or 3 years, because they weren't paid by their salaries by the state because of this bank system issue. The various humanitarian agencies, UNICEF, WHO, and others have been paying not full salaries, but paying people something so that they could survive. Now, currently, as we all know, the WHO funds have been cut significantly by President Trump, and you have a load of other problems, and so a lot of these payments are more or less stopping. So at a time when there's very little option to deal with the situation. So coming to COVID, you can understand that it's coming on the back of an already pretty dire situation. You have a country that's now divided between the northern area, which is, you know, basically the Houthi-controlled area, which is now, if you look at where I'm pointing at the map, it covers, you know, about all of this lot. So it's really quite a large area, and where the majority of the population is. And then you have the rest of the country, which is supposedly under the control of the government, but in practice under the control of different local groups. So you've had different reactions from different authorities at the local level, and to me, they look like very much like erratic responses and panicky responses, and that has included certain statements, you know, forms of very open racism. I mean, accusations. There's a story going at the moment, and it's not clear which is correct. One that the Saudis have sent 800 Somalis across the border and thrown them into Jove. The Saudis say, no, it wasn't. It's the Houthis who sent these people there. You know, there's a lot of racism going on, and accusation that the disease is being brought from outside by people, particularly not Yemenis. There's been quarantine areas set up between the areas that they're controlled by the different groups in the country. I mean, these quarantine areas look like a chaotic market with no food, no facilities, no health, no water, no toilets. I mean, the pictures one saw of them were deeply shocking. So you've got a very, you have a preparation. There's been a very positive international effort initiated by a Yemeni humanitarian organization connected with the biggest Yemeni-based company, the Hail Said Foundation. They've got together a number of other companies around the world, and they're shipping protective equipment into Yemen, and they're buying it and shipping it and distributing it, which is it's the first major effort that's taken place. The WHO is trying to do something, but it has its limitations, financial and other. And it's all happening in the context also of complete misinformation. So people don't know, some people just don't believe any of this is going on. Other people think, it's going to kill them in 24 hours. I mean, there's every amount of, presumably also phony medications. So the level of incorrect rumors that are going on are very, very frightening. And clearly, people are terrified, and they have every reason to be, given the chaos that's prevailing.
It's an interesting
officially
point.
Sorry, just for the record, officially there's 56 cases have been declared as of yesterday, but I mean, this is really of little, I wouldn't put that down.
If you're not able to test, which I imagine that it is tricky in that situation, then you're not going to know. And one thing, to your point about the humanitarian aid, and this is why I like these briefings, is we just had a briefing last week with someone from the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, Adrian Fricke, who was talking about how, particularly in times of crisis, it can be extra hard for humanitarian workers to do their work because there is a trust breakdown, there is a communication breakdown, and in a situation like this, people become suspicious of even humanitarian workers sometimes. So I don't know if that's the case in Yemen.
Absolutely, and I mean, just to add, while you were saying this, I just remembered apparently the Houthis have now, the WHO have now instructed all their staff in their local centers to not go to work because the system, there's no protective system. There's nothing able to help them operate. I mean, I heard that today. I don't know if it's actually true, but it would make sense, because if they can't work in a safe environment, should they be working at all?
Yes, yeah, and then just following up on some of your point about aid, the United States just announced $225 million in emergency aid to Yemen following a suspension in aid programs. So what is your assessment of this assistance? Is it sufficient? Who need it most?
Well, I think basically what happened is that the U.S. stopped its aid to Yemen a couple of months ago, and I forget what was the amount that was cancelled, and that is because of another complicated argument going on between the Houthis and the UN about controlling and managing the aid in the Houthi-controlled areas. So, as I understand it, the new offer of aid from the U.S. is specifically to operate outside of the Houthi-controlled areas. Now, the importance of that is that the Houthi-controlled areas mean 70% of the population, roughly. So the majority of the people are under Houthi control. And moreover, the majority of the people in need are also under Houthi control. So, certainly I'm sure that the aid, whatever aid is coming, will be welcome up to a point. And again, it depends on its management, because all the Houthi control is obviously something everybody is extremely angry about, because everybody is against the Houthis. But it's also in the rest of the country that the there are also cases of diversion and misuse of aid. So, but I'm sure that, and hopefully if this goes through, well, I was going to say if it goes through the World Health Organization, but presumably that's unlikely given the latest decision by your president. So, but still, if it goes through, reputable outfits like UNICEF or the Red Cross or the Red Crescent or whatever, then that the chances are that it would be that it will be welcome. I mean, any aid is welcome. The overall humanitarian situation is extremely serious because in all previous years, you had a humanitarian response plan that was announced. I mean, last year it was 4 point something billion. For this year, they said it was going to be 3.4 billion, but they didn't announce the plan. They didn't do the needs assessment, which they usually do, mainly because of these issues between the Houthis and the UN about the management. I just saw today that they're now planning a pledging conference for the 2nd of June. Now, pledging conferences are usually held in Geneva in February. There was one planned for April in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia because, which also, raises some questions about humanitarian aid by the main protagonist of the war. But that was cancelled because of COVID. So now I presume the new one, which will be done electronically, like everything else we're all doing, will happen on the 2nd of June. But then, we're talking about, we're halfway through the year, and the current level of aid that's been made available compared to the 3.4 billion, I forget, I wrote it down somewhere, but I haven't got it with me. I mean, I think that up to now, they've had access to about 450 million out of basically what they need as 3.4 billion for the year. So, it's certainly time to have a pledging conference, but pledging is one thing, and then, handing over is another. And we're talking about an environment where everybody is cutting everything, including international aid. I mean, the financial situation at the world level isn't exactly brilliant right now. So, prospects are not brilliant.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, that is true. The environment has changed pretty catastrophically, and it sounds like kind of mirroring the complexity within the country is complexity externally. And so when it comes to U.S. aid, I'd just like to dig in a little bit more on that because obviously I think it's pretty clear that the U.S. interest in Yemen doesn't have to do with Yemen directly, but has to do with dynamics in the region, whether it's with Iran or whether it's with counterterrorism. Could you just expand on how you see the U.S. looking at its role in Yemen and what the outlook is for that?
Yeah, I think we need to go back a few years on that, really, because we need to look at the beginning of the war. I mean, as we know, the U.S. has been closely allied and supporting Saudi Arabia for decades. And, in 2015, we were at a time when the Obama presidency was busy organizing its JCPOA deal with Iran, which is something that seriously irritated the Saudis. So although I understand that the Obama administration was not particularly enthusiastic about starting the war in Yemen, they felt that they had to support the Saudis, regardless of what they were doing and regardless of the wisdom, simply because, this was a kind of quid pro quo for the Saudis putting up with the negotiations with Iran. Now, under the Trump administration, it's very clear that, there was this close relationship between Trump and MBS, and that it was all based on billions of dollars of further weapons being bought by the Saudis, and has also been, to my knowledge, increasing Congress action against this and trying to stop it, which has failed, but hopefully at some point it will succeed. But basically, I think the U.S. position is that it's out to support the Saudis. It's obviously out to oppose the Iranians. Now, there is an idea, I think, that, the Houthis are Iranian proxies. Now, the Houthis are connected, have Iranian connections, but they are not proxies, and they are their own, people or whatever, their own ideology. Now, when it suits them, the Houthis will listen to the Iranians, and when it doesn't suit them, they won't. And so, and of course, from the Iranian point of view, the Yemen thing is a cheap win. It's costing them practically nothing. They have, it's peanuts from their point of view, and it's irritating, or even more than irritating, the Saudis, which is one of their objectives. So basically, they're onto a really good thing with the Yemen war. But I think it's a mistake for the U.S. to believe, or U.S. administration to believe, that if we solve if we sort something out with Iran, it will it will sort out the Houthi situation, because the two things are not directly related. There is a slight connection, but it's not a full connection. And I think the other problem, for those of us who've been involved in Yemen and in development and in activities, is that if we look at the US policy over the decades, in Yemen, it has not been a policy connected with Yemen and with helping Yemenis, except for maybe some decades back. Whether one agrees with the development policies or not, I think, which is another issue that should be dealt with. But even, from that point of view, the US policy in Yemen has largely been focused on counterterrorism and on Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and on basically counterterrorism policy. And as somebody who used to say, is the US doesn't have a Yemen policy, they have a counterterrorism policy. And I think now we have to add to the counterterrorism, we have to add the anti-Iran policy. And those are really the moving elements. And of course, the sales of weapons, which is not insignificant. I mean, from the US point of view, though, it's probably not as significant as some like to say.
Okay. Thank you, Helen. That is a really kind of eye-opening rundown of what U.S. interests are, and then also, I think, a very important point about the relationship between the Houthis and Iran. So with that, I've gone over my time for questions, although I do have many more, but I'd like to start to turn to the Q&A box. So for those of you who are listening, if you would like to ask a question, please do put it in the Q&A box, and I see some coming in, so we'll just start in the order in which they've been received. So the first question is, has there been any recent involvement by Russia? There was some past involvement when Yemen was separated into North and South republics, but this questioner would like a little bit more context on if there's any current involvement by Russia.
Yeah, the Russians are the one state that continued having an embassy in Sana'a until well into the war, basically until the Houthis killed their previous ally and even earlier enemy, Ali Abdullah Saleh, in end of 2017. The Russians basically, I think, are sitting on the side, waiting for an opportunity to mediate or to improve their position. At the United Nations Security Council, there's been a general unanimity on the Yemen issue, except that the Russians did not vote, but they did not veto, but they didn't vote on the resolution 2216, which is the one that justifies the military involvement. And there have been more debates and more involvement of Russia but they've talked to everybody. They've had Houthi missions visiting them. They've had government missions visiting them. As most of us know, there's been more and more involvement with Saudi Arabia. So I think basically the Russians are on a sort of wait and see operation, or watch and wait for an opportunity, I think, is probably the way I would put it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Very, very interesting. So the next question is, how can we improve the international aid system so we can ensure the assistance reaches the right people and isn't captured by groups?
Well, that's a really difficult one. I wish I had the answer to that. I think it's an extremely difficult situation because, in many countries, and Yemen is one of them, you are in a situation where the operators on the ground, the local organizations on the ground are very unproven, are very new. They didn't really exist till very recently. And their quality and performance and transparency would be the official word, varies and ranges. So you have some wonderful outfits with fantastic people who are totally devoted, and you have some other outfits of people who are trying to see what they can get out of it personally. And and I think this applies to some extent also to international NGOs. Not all international NGOs perform brilliantly, and there have been a few scandals, and there's been also scandals around the UN operations. So it's a very, very difficult question. I think ideally one would want to, in my view, ideally one would like to operate through reputable national organizations and through government institutions. I mean, for example, on health issues, one should be able to operate through ministries of health and their staff directly. This is not the current fashion in humanitarian or in international government policies. And I think other than that, what I would say is that in Yemen, as in other countries, the thing is to identify a few organizations that one knows to be performing adequately and not taking massive overheads and not, and having a minimum of personnel issues and operate through them, I think is probably the only thing I can suggest. But I think it's a very important fundamental question, and not just in Yemen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. So our next questioner is someone who worked in Yemen and would like to ask a question live, I believe. So Brian, would you be able to unmute James? And James, we're going to put you on, okay?
Okay, thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Helen, very much. I really appreciate this excellent overview. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
thank you.
Yeah, in fact, I actually led the work of the UN in Yemen from 2000 to mid-2004. So I've been following events there. And of course, those were better times. Some of us, at least, were cautiously optimistic that Yemen could cope with the many challenges it had at the time, the North-South divide, the water scarcity, etc. We never envisioned that, Yemen of today would arise. It's a, terribly tragic situation. I wanted to thank you for putting in perspective the Iranian versus Saudi contribution to the crisis. I mean, I think many people in the United States believe that they're equivalent. And I think you've made it very clear that although the Iranians definitely are helping the Houthis, the role of the Saudis and the UAE, at least until recently, far outweighs the Iranian intervention. And to consider the Houthis as some type of pawn of the Iranians is really miscasting the situation. My question, I have two questions. First of all, looking 5 years down the road, what would, or 10 years, what would be your most optimistic scenario for Yemen with all the intractable problems that it has at this point? And second, what would be your advice to American citizens at this time in terms of those of us that are concerned with Yemen? Should we be putting most of our emphasis on continuing to push Congress to limit and hopefully end the Saudi intervention in Yemen? Should it be on humanitarian assistance, some combination of the two? Those would be my two questions. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for these questions. I'll answer the second one first because that's the easy one. Mm-hmm. I think really the thing to do is basically both. As you said, I think the role of Congress has been very important. And, although it has not succeeded, it's been very interesting to see the evolution where, you had a very limited number of votes in favor of stopping the weapons in the first few occasions, and the number increased until it actually got to be a majority. And I think that's very important. I think it had an impact on stopping the in-flight refueling of the planes, which I think was also, had an important, was something that had an immediate impact. I believe, I'm not an expert on these matters. And, in the long run, I think it would be, it is important. I think on humanitarian, what I would say is, don't restrict humanitarian activities to relief and focus more on development investments. I think it's really much more important to have, there's no reason why you can't do development when there's fighting. People in 15, 16 were all saying, oh, we can't do development until we have security. We can't do blah, blah. And I ended up saying, well, you haven't got security and you haven't got development, so why don't you try development and see if that gives you security? And I still believe that, and I don't think I've persuaded that many people. So I think that's and that would be the answer to your second question. Your first question, I think really I have to come back to you and say, are you talking about Dreamland or are you talking about reality?
Well, let's
if
say
you're
reality.
talking about if you're talking about Dreamland, I suppose one would love to see the kind of democratic state that people demonstrated for in 2011, that the youth and the people, well, not just the youth, the majority of Yemenis would like, you know, reasonable governance, good quality health and education services, you know, possibilities for economic development and all these things. I don't know. I mean, all I can say is that, you know, when this war started, somebody I'm very close to saw the first piece I wrote in April 2015 on open democracy, which said this is the beginning of a long and very nasty war and let nobody be fooled, or words to that effect. And 6 months later, he said to me, you know, when you wrote that, I thought you were crazy. And he didn't think that any longer. So I think I'd say, I mean, I'm fairly convinced that the internationalization of this war is going to draw to a close somehow fairly soon. The Saudis are going to, you know, if not sign a deal, it will basically fizzle out, as I was saying earlier. The Emiratis have already largely moved out. The question is, you know, how much indirect support are they still willing to give to their clients? In this case, I would say much more straightforwardly, the Southern Transitional Council, who are at the moment having a fight with the, you know, I mean, we didn't go into that because that's another whole issue, but I did write a piece on the topic on the ECFR last Friday, if anybody wants to see it. So I think, you know, the internationalization of this war is going to, at worst fizzle out, and at best end up with some kind of deal within, I'd say, probably a couple of years. But that leaves the Yemeni war, which is what was there to start with. And that is going to be much, much worse, because now we're going to be talking about, you know, people saying, my brother, my son, my uncle, my daughter, you know, was killed by one of your guys, etc. And this needs to be responded to. In addition, you have a very low economic base. I mean, even if oil prices got back to $100 a barrel, you know, the Yemeni oil production at best would be 150,000 barrels a day, which is absolute peanuts by any standards. You know, you don't have economic resources to rebuild the country, and you don't have the kind of serious, you don't have I suppose a ruling group that is committed to the welfare of the population. I think there are thousands of Yemenis, millions of Yemenis who want improved living conditions and who desperately need them. But is there anywhere the kind of leadership that can emerge to help them get there with the very, very limited natural resources that the country has? You know, most countries with very few natural resources compensate by having high levels of education. I mean, look at South Korea, to a smaller extent, look at Jordan. You know, you go in for the modern knowledge economy, etc., etc. Yemen has an education system which is incredibly weak and incredibly unprepared. So I don't know. I mean, I'd say my most optimistic version from that point of view would be, of course, the one thing that will solve many Yemeni problems would be the GCC allowing Yemeni workers in, because then you can have a new migration, you know, a new set of people who are earning adequate incomes and who can finance their families and who can finance local infrastructure. If you look at what was happening in the 70s with the local development associations and similar organizations, you know, you had a whole community-based development system, which was in some places extremely impressive. And, you know, the ability of Yemenis to send back serious remittances, again, would permit the community level to develop. And I mean, what I've been arguing, you know, for the last few years is that, you know, do community-based development, do community-based investments. Don't just focus on peace, education, blah, blah, but focus on building people's economic capacity at the community level and the self-management, and that can lead to the build-up of a new political entity with much better people. But of course, you know, to get to the new political entity, we are talking about 10 or 15 or 20 years.
Right. Right.
So I'm sorry, I don't know if that
Thank you
begins
very
to
much.
address your
thank you very
point.
much. Thank you very much. Mhm.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, James, for that question. So our next question is, I think we're bumping up close to time, but we have a couple more questions. So I'll ask this one, and then the next one will be also asked live. So the Yemeni civil war is one of the worst humanitarian problems our world is facing, but it seems like people, particularly in the US, don't talk about the issue very much. Why do you think there isn't the same sense of urgency among the general population that we see in other international crises?
I think there's a number. I mean, I can't really speak for the situation to the US because I really don't know the US. But if I look at the situation in Europe, for example, you know, and to what I understand of the situation in the US is that there's generally a very limited interest in international affairs. My understanding is that most US citizens are not actually really that interested in anything that's happening outside of the country. So I'm sure that's one element. I think another element which is relevant both in the US and in Europe is the complexity of the situation. Now, all major political situations are complex. I mean, Libya's not simple, Syria's not simple, you know, and we can go on. But somehow I think Yemen seems to have a certain level of complexity and remoteness. You know, I mean, it's not, you know, it's a country of about 30 million people. It's not a, you know, and it's not somewhere that's got major resources. I mean, if all this was happening in Saudi, I mean, with a, you know, with 10 or 11 million barrels of oil per day, and I forget how many years of reserves, you know, there'd be much greater interest. I mean, look at Iraq. I mean, Iraq provides much higher level of interest. So I think that you know, that the remoteness on the one hand, the complexity, and a general lack of interest in international situations are probably all relevant factors. And, you know, and also, I mean, there's been a limited media, you know, very limited media interest. And I think on that one, it's also important to notice, particularly, I think, in the States, but I don't have the, you know, the details, that you have had a big effort from public relations companies. The Saudis and the Emiratis are financing some major lobbying and other outfits who basically want to keep this quiet and who, you know, who haven't promoted articles on the topic. Rather, they've done, you know, they've avoided articles on the topic. So I think that those are all factors that are relevant, and there may be others. But as I said, you know, I'm not a US-based person, and I hardly know the country.
No, Helen, I think it's, I mean, it's an excellent answer. And I think, you know, the idea of the lack of interest in the United States is one that drives me. And to your point about the media coverage, I mean, that's something I gave this in a speech a couple of years ago, and it's on our website. But it's something like the amount of time that major news networks devoted to international stories declined from, I forget what year that the baseline was, but it was something like 1,600 minutes in, it may have been 1980 or somewhere in 1990, down, and it was an election year. So these were both election years, down to 500 minutes in, I think, 20. So it's
on, I mean, all international issues.
Yes, all international issues. So
Wow.
there were the coverage has just, I think, declined pretty dramatically.
That is shocking.
So
I mean, 500 minutes isn't much.
It's not much at all. And again, please don't quote me on that because it could be wrong, but it is. I do have listed on our website. But with that, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'd like to turn to Nadim, who would like to ask his question live.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, good. Okay. Hi, Helen. I'm Nadim Shhadi. I accidentally became the publisher of your first book when I inherited Ithaca Press from David Walton.
So, oh, wow. That was a long time ago.
That was a very long time ago. So, the shortest way I can explain my question is that I'm from Lebanon, where we have a similar group, Hezbollah, that is very similar to the Houthis in the sense that there is always plausible deniability with their connection to Iran. They also hold the country hostage when it comes to aid. The aid has to go through them, otherwise it doesn't come. Such groups exist in Palestine, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, and could be in other, germinating in other places, maybe Afghanistan or whatever, Pakistan, I don't know. So I understand the specificity of Yemen, but we are facing a regional issue in a sense, because all these groups fly under one banner, which is the IRGC, and it could be that a solution has to be done for all of them at the same time rather than try and do it piecemeal. That's my question.
Well, I mean, I follow events in the other countries to a much lesser extent than I follow them in Yemen. I think, I think it's going back really to what I was saying earlier, which is, on the one hand, there is an international issue with Iran. I wouldn't like to think that it's an issue about Shiism versus Sunnism. I think it's it's fundamentally a political issue which arose, if you remember, in the 70s. Iran was the greatest friend of the US and the policemen of the Gulf under the Shah. So, I don't think it's an issue of sectarianism. I think it's very much a real political issue of power and power relations. And one shouldn't forget that the Wahhabism and the extreme Sunni versions have been circulating around the Middle East and way beyond, also for a considerable extent. So I would say that there is an issue of the relationship between Iran and the rest of the world. To what extent, I wouldn't like to say to what extent, the Hezbollah or the groups in Syria and others are closer or more, say, subservient to Iranian desires than others. But what I would say in the case of Yemen is that although the relationship with Iran has increased and worsened from the Houthi point of view, improved or from the Iranian point of view, improved in the last 2 or 3 years, it is not the fundamental issue that is faced by Yemenis. The fundamental issues that are faced by Yemenis are issues of political power and not of sectarianism. And I think at the moment now, if you still look at the situation, I would say that in terms of, personal bitterness and resentment and call it, ethnicism is the word I use, but I haven't found the right word. The tension between Southerners and Northerners is much stronger than the sectarian tension. The differences between the Zaydis and the Shafi'is in Yemen are minimal at the theological level and in other levels. So I think, certainly with respect to Yemen, I wouldn't say that dealing with Iran is the solution to the problem. And I think, even if you're looking at in the wider sense, it's also very important to, look at the political issues and the level of influence that is attempted, not just by Iran, but also by the other side. I mean, look at who were the people who were sent out, who were supported by the Saudis and the Emiratis in Syria. I mean, they aren't exactly angels either. So I think that's my lot on this one.
All right, and I think we're probably just at about time. So with that, I know we did have another question come in, but what I'll do maybe is we'll follow up with you directly on that, Helen. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you to everyone who called in. To those who asked questions, we really appreciate it. We're switching gears on Thursday for our next briefing, and we'll be talking about North Korea. So we have a panel discussion, and that will be at 6 p.m. Eastern time. So I hope you all will join, and please keep an eye out for some more of the virtual briefings. And again, Helen, thank you so much. If anyone on the call is interested in reading more, her book is out, and that's In Crisis: The Road to War. And oh, there it is. That's great. So, and we'll send around a link so that if you're interested, you can follow up. So Helen, thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you for joining us and for the terrific map. And thank you everyone for jumping on the call as well.
Yeah, and thank you for the interesting discussion.
Yeah.
And interesting contributions. So also good luck for you for the rest of your plans.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.